Hello and welcome. So I finally got around to creating some Reaper templates for pre and post EQ and a Compander, which is a compressor followed by an expander. Companders are usually associated with formats for transmission or, like vinyl and tape and things. But they're still very useful and I'm going to go into all that. But first of all, I've got this drum groove. I just brought it down about 5 decibels to give myself some headroom. But yeah, a drum groove like this is ideal for testing because it has a whole range of different frequencies with the different drum hits. And there's also space in between them, so we can hear the sustain of the room sound. So here then you can see that on the source track we have the drum groove item, and then the source track is sending to the blue process track. And then this track has its phase flipped. And this is just so that we can do a null test, and it's a way that we can test as plugins to make sure that they are not making any changes to the sound. So whenever this track is unmuted, the two tracks will cancel each other out. There. Now you can see on the Sun track that there's no signal reaching the meter. And this is because as the source track is pushing the speaker, the process track is pulling the speaker by the exact same amount, which results in no movement at all. And even when I enable all these effects, they're not actually having any effect on the audio. That is because the EQs, for example, are completely linear. Pro Q3 has no sound of its own. However, the multiband compressors would introduce non-linearities if they were acting upon the audio, which they're not at the moment. Anyway, I'm going to turn off everything for now, except the first EQ. If I boost this frequency, we're now hearing a difference between the two tracks. They no longer cancel out perfectly. And that's obviously because we're only boosting this frequency, or cutting it, on the process track. But then you might be thinking, well, there we go then. It has a sound, doesn't it? If it's changing the audio. And what I mean by it doesn't have a sound of its own is that it doesn't introduce any kind of artifacting or distortion into the signal. And so in this case, where we have a pre and post EQ, we can boost a frequency on the pre-EQ and cut it by the same amount on the post-EQ, and then the audio that comes out of the post-EQ will be identical to the audio going into the pre-EQ. So all I did was just link the controls in Reaper so that when you make a boost on the pre-EQ, it cuts on the post-EQ. And of course, the two tracks are still being summed. And so now let's test. So if while it's playing, I boost or cut this band, we can hear no signal coming through on the sum bus. And the perfect cancelling out proves that the two EQs working in tandem this way are actually imparting no changes on the audio at all. It's perfectly digitally clean, transparent, utterly characterless, but Pro Q3 makes for a perfect tool in a situation such as this. But we'll come back to this. Moving on, we also have the Compander, or more specifically, it's a compressor followed by an expander. And if you really want to be pedantic, it's a multiband compressor followed by a multiband expander. And the idea is that when we compress using the first instance of Pro MB, we also expand by the same amount using the second instance. And this forms the bulk of the companding process. But usually in companding, EQs are also used. However, unlike with the EQs, compression and expansion are destructive. And what you're hearing there is the destruction itself, as this information is lost. Anyway, let's get a little bit more practical now. Because the send is a pre-fader send, we can actually turn the channel down, and then if we put the phase back to normal, we're hearing everything as it should be, in phase. Now if we use this button here to toggle the effects, you'll probably get some stuttering. So if you open the effects pane and you select the effects you want to toggle, then using Ctrl and B you can toggle all the effects together and they won't stutter. So what's that on a Mac? Option and B? I don't know, but it just might work for you. Anyway, if I toggle these we shouldn't hear any difference at the moment. And we don't, because the effects aren't doing anything yet. But now, the way to think about all this is this separator here. Anything above it is the encoding process, and anything below it is the decoding process. So in the context of tape companding, the encoder is on the recording side and the decoder is on the playback side. This can be used in different ways. For example, different tape formulas respond differently in terms of both frequency response and dynamic response. So the idea is that you encode the signal onto the tape in such a way as to maximize its characteristics. So if a tape had less bass response, then you could pre-emphasize the bass frequencies by boosting them right up. And then on playback, on the decoder side, you would de-emphasize those changes to return the audio back to its normal state for the listener. And if we're just doing pre and post emphasis EQ, that's fine, as I've already shown. But of course, if we're going to compress the signal in the encoder, we can never completely expand that back out without any artifacting. And this gives companding its character. And also, just as a side note, while I'm thinking about it, companding is used in noise reduction as well. But never mind all this stuff, because we're not using tape or anything. We'll hold it right there, hold the phone. Because the ideas behind all this are still sound, no pun intended, to this very day. For example, we can put a non-linear effect in the middle where the separator is, and we can change the way it responds. So if we put some kind of saturation in the middle there, we can change how the signal hits the saturation and change its characteristics. So what I've done is I've just brought this old distortion plugin I made across into the project. It's got its quirks, and so it never got released. But I keep it around because every now and then it's great for mangling. Check it out. Okay then, so yeah, that's now adding quite a lot of distortion. So that's going to be our non-linear saturation distortion within the middle of the compander. And so that's going to be clipping the signal quite extensively. But the tone control on this plugin was kind of naff, so it's the perfect candidate to use a compander, either the EQs or the compressor, or maybe a combination of both, to shape the distortion further, without necessarily changing the tonality of the sound. So let's start with the EQ then. By boosting the frequencies in this band, they're then hitting the saturation harder. So we can saturate the lows. Or we can desaturate the lows. We can also get some crazy percussive effects out of this. And if we really push it, we can make it wobble too. Right there. So I've landed on some settings. So if I bypass them, you can see that the actual peaks are louder. So obviously these are as you can see, the pre-EQ was cut in the lows. So what about if I turn off all the Compander stuff? It's quieter because the distortion level's lower. But in post I will edit it so they're the same volume-ish. But as you can hear, the distortion is across the entire spectrum of the kit. But when the Compander stuff is active, oh baby. That is because certain bands of frequencies are being compressed or pre-emphasized or de-emphasized, and it totally changes the character of the saturation as a result. Not all the frequencies are being distorted the same. Some are being compressed, others boosted but also compressed. And the expander is obviously set the same across its controls, but just with reductions and expansions where the other boosts or compressors. Anyway, let's remove the distortion and then also disable the Compander stuff. Yep, it gives it substantially more energy. And that distortion as well on the toms and snare. Just really adds some nice depth. Now, I'm not saying that the pre-EQ and the compression settings and everything are what I would necessarily use. I just tried to find more extreme settings to highlight what I was getting across. This whole pre-emphasis, post-de-emphasis malarkey. And because we're compensating in the post-EQ for any boost that we do in the pre-EQ, and likewise with the compressors, the tonality shift that you heard in the audio was just the saturation and the way certain frequencies were saturating and others not so much, as opposed to hearing any EQing itself in any kind of direct way. So anyway, that's just what I've been mucking about with. And if you haven't used any of these techniques before, definitely give it a try. It can breathe a lot of new life into plugins that you've already got without you going out and buying more. So I would encourage you to give it a go and experiment with it. Of course, the most annoying part about it all was linking all the controls and everything. But you only have to do it once and then you can save a template. So yeah, that's what I did. Anyway, if you like this content or found any of it interesting at all, Feel free to comment, like, share and subscribe. You know the deal. And until next time, thank you for watching.